Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the declining prestige of higher education, Biden's eroding support among Black and Hispanic voters, Woody Allen's new film, which significantly none of us have seen and aren't likely to anytime soon, and the disinterment of Revenants. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Geoff Shullenberger, and Nina Power, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. This week, the New York Times Magazine published a long article noting that higher education, once one of the most respected institutions in the country, has faced rapidly declining levels of support and is also a less popular option among high school graduates. The percentage of young adults who said that a college degree is very important has fallen to 41% from 74%. About a third of Americans say they have a lot of confidence in higher education. That figure is down significantly. The article, written by Paul Tuff, good name, traces the decline in support to one thing. He points out that the college wage premium remains very high. If you have a college degree, your wages are likely to be higher. That's true as well. If you have a postgraduate degree, that tends to bump up your wages. But what he calls the college wealth premium, citing various experts, has declined. So you're going to have higher wages with a college degree, but your wealth won't necessarily be higher. That, of course, has to do with the fact of college debt and how much more expensive college has become. Since 1992, the price of tuition has doubled on average. We have a couple of ex-academics, I think it's fair to say, on the podcast. What are we to make of the transformation of higher ed? Is it just a matter of these economic factors, tough sites, or is there something else going on here?
I often find this whole discussion sort of frustrating because higher ed in the U.S. is such a vast category encompassing a wide range of different types of institutions that, promise different things to their students. It's hard to generalize, but one way that I would read this in terms of sort of themes that we often discuss, publish on, etc., is that since the 1970s, 1980s, as we saw the kind of previous social compact collapse and the new one, more broadly understood as neoliberalism, sort of emerge, there was a, declining ability to say, raise, say like my grandparents neither finished high school, but both were able to own a home and ultimately send my mother to college. This was a relatively typical thing in that generation and period. There was a more generalized precarity and lack of ability to find those kind of positions. But the supposed compensation for this offered by politicians really, across much of the political spectrum was that, well, if we just push more and more education, if we just get more and more kids educated and more kids going to college and finishing college, then somehow this will compensate for the otherwise precarious situation in which average people find themselves. So, in some sense, this was kind of the new model of, I'd say, sort of previously more directly egalitarian sort of social compact, which, Sohrab in his piece after the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, described the shift from a certain understanding that goes back to a really early period in the country that, that there were certain guarantees of, what is often maligned as a kind of equality of outcomes, right? And there were various ways that society was arranged to enable this. And, instead what we saw was the rise of this meritocratic understanding that, yes, everyone had equality of opportunity, but in order to reach that point, you had to, work your way through this meritocratic series of hoops to jump through. But, that the role of government, and again, I find this kind of surprising how forgotten this is, that, you had No Child Left Behind under the Bush administration is maybe one of the clearest examples of this, right? If we just, and this was, George W. Bush and Ted Kennedy collaborating on this, right? So it's really the full sort of political spectrum involved as it was represented in Washington at the time. And it was committed to this idea that you could somehow generate equality just by getting more and more people through education. And there are various just, without getting into it in too much detail, there are various sort of obvious, just kind of logical flaws with this whole understanding of things, as well as just kind of empirical problems that have been evident from very early on. Our contributor Freddie DeBoer's first book, The Cult of Smart, is quite good at kind of showing how this myth took hold, and of kind of universal access to higher education as the social panacea, and the harms that this has done. So as far as this article goes, it's a good illustration of the fact that I think more people are waking up to the false promises of this model, right? Which I think is ultimately a good thing, because it has clearly been failing to achieve the things that it promised to achieve for some time, and only once that's acknowledged. And one interesting thing in the article is just showing that more and more just average people of younger generation and rising generations don't really buy the hype about college anymore, and for quite good reason. So an important moment in just kind of the broader reassessment of the economic paradigm and socioeconomic paradigm that we're existing within.
This isn't necessarily such a bad thing, because the model that we had developed, especially over the past 2 generations, let's say, in which everyone was encouraged to go to college in search of a kind of information-based job, broadly speaking, that's a really wide category. And everything else that was available was basically service industry precarity. That was not a good model. Our friend Michael Lind describes that as one major cause of today's, whatever you want to call them, woke wars, identity wars, because you have all these people who have been expensively credentialed, and the only way they have out of the precarity of the rest, which is service industry precarity, is to compete for a relatively few or not enough informatic credential-based jobs. And so what do they do in order to enhance their status in this war of all against war is to wage identity warfare or come up with new categories of credentialedness, like having grievances or having suffered historic harms. And so, as we shift away from that, one very important thing to do is to create an economy that, matches what we aspire to, which is the likelihood that most Americans, as they haven't historically, won't go to college, but they still should be able to earn a relatively high wage that allows them to make ends meet, to retire in dignity, to have healthcare, etc. A kind of a high wage, manufacturing-oriented economy, and that requires industrial policy. It requires investment in training our people in non-college educated paths, but there are lots of jobs of the future. Actually, in the green sector, you could say, certainly in healthcare, that's going to become more and more important, etc. That they don't necessarily need degrees, and they don't need the added credentials of identity warfare, but they can make ends meet. So as this transition happens away from college, which I think it's kind of salutary, it's just incumbent on policymakers to work toward building an economy that matches where people are heading anyway.
So the article makes a deal of the fact that America, at the moment at least, is a kind of outlier, and negatively compares the situation there to Europe. Obviously, there are different fee regimes in different parts of Europe, which is noted. In some places, it's more or less free or extremely minimal. In the UK, we have an increasingly American system. So people are graduating with 50 or 60K worth of debt. And I think we're probably about 5 or 10 years behind America, and this kind of, multi-pronged reason why people might not attend university. I increasingly know of younger people who are not going to attend university because they don't think it's worth it financially, in terms of this kind of college wage gap or university wage gap, and are instead kind of turning to more sort of artisanal type practices, which I guess sort of became like a hipster thing a few 15, 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, at the moment, we've got a kind of middle class that is clinging on and trying not to sink into the working class. I think we're still at that stage of a kind of self-preservation. But I think without a higher model, without any higher image of what it means to study, like what are we studying for, like the national intellect or citizenship or to become better moral beings. Instead, everything is presented as a kind of investment, as an individualism, and there is no kind of collective purpose or meaning to university. And this is part of the problem. I think it's actually a kind of almost spiritual question. When education has no other purpose other than to sort of simply perpetuate or prolong a situation economically, then it becomes absolutely debased of any of the things you actually need for intellectual inquiry, such as enthusiasm and curiosity, aspiration, and all of those things. So I think there is this kind of moral or spiritual dimension. And we at the UK are just a little bit behind you.
This week, a poll from New York Times Siena showed that President Biden's support among Black and Hispanic voters has continued to erode. This is a long-running trend, but the numbers have been getting more dire for Biden and for the Democratic Party more generally. He's now favored by these voters by just 53% to 28% in a matchup with Donald Trump. He won 70% of those voters in 2020. So very large decline of 17%. Geoff, what do you make of Dark Brandon's declining support with, what's really viewed as the base of the Democratic Party?
It's not that surprising in terms of the prior trend lines going back to 2020. And, I think it also speaks to the little examined but significant sort of class dimension of this whole discussion, which media tends to want to see things in terms of racial determinism and, sort of divide people up that way. We tend to kind of miss out on this, but, there is just this ongoing shift in terms of, sort of downscale voters towards the Republican Party and of upscale voters, including, people in sort of white affluent suburbs in, places outside of Atlanta, being one notable example towards the Democrats. So there's just this class, this sort of shakeup in terms of class party affiliation. Obviously, Black voters are a significant demographic within the Democratic Party, but I'm guessing there's probably also a kind of generational dimension here. Historically, the Black vote, and this is all relatively speculative, but is functions very much, and this is what is often talked about in sort of derogatory and disgusted terms on the right, but it functions similar to how various kinds of mass political machines for mobilizing voters have worked at various points in American history. Famously, you have sort of Black churches as a kind of center of political organizing. And, the right's kind of disdain for this type of mobilization is, I think, ultimately not particularly politically beneficial, because if you fetishize individuals sitting at home and quietly contemplating their voting decisions and then getting themselves to the polls individually, this is itself a very class-based model of how politics works. And it just so happens that the people whose voting habits function that way tend to be turning away from the Republicans. The larger issue here is that I think as you see the Black church perhaps having less influence over younger generations, and particularly of Black men who are, probably, kind of forming their identities in different ways and often in ways that might bring them into cultural milieus that are hostile to the sort of elite democratic culture in various ways. You're going to have a certain disaggregation of the Black vote, I'm guessing, in terms of, its historic mobilization through these kind of venerable institutions. And you're going to have more kind of free agency among voters in that demographic as in others. So I think that's one story here that, one would like to see more in-depth reporting on rather than just sort of poll numbers. It just seems to me obvious that block quality of black voting is very much tied to this kind of integration into institutions that mobilize the vote en masse, right? And this is no different than how it works in other communities. I mean, I live right next to a very large Orthodox Jewish area of New York City, and it's very similar there. They're politically powerful because they can mobilize people en masse and have the ability to do that because of people's integration into institutions. As society, and more broadly in many contexts, becomes more fragmented and people become more detached from these kind of organizing institutions, there's going to be less of that kind of mass voting, although in some communities it will remain strong. That's going to kind of shake things up, at least gradually and in the long term. So I think that's one interesting question that it would be good to see more reporting on. And then as far as, the Hispanic vote, obviously, we've seen a lot of reporting on this coming out of 2020, but, it does sometimes just seem like weirdly difficult to get the significance of this stuff across to the media class that, they spent 4 years claiming that this was the return of full-throated white supremacy. And yet, we actually have a large shift of voters away from the Democrats during that entire period, of voters of color, right, of non-white voting groups away from the Democrats throughout that period. So, this is obviously very significant. I think the other interesting point is that the question of how voters are mobilized, right? When you poll people, who can you actually be reliably sure will go to the polls? Well, generally it's people who have previously gone to the polls, right? And it may be that some of this fizzles out, but as Cohn discusses, this may still be significant because it might just mean that many of these younger Black and Hispanic voters are simply not voting, right? That their disaffiliation with the Democrats might not take the form of voting for Trump or another nominee if such a thing were to happen, but it could simply take the form of not voting. And if you go back to 2016, that was a significant factor in Hillary Clinton's loss that year.
It's fascinating to see how the warnings of the white supremacy of the right, as you say, Geoff, really haven't been dented in any way by these really profound trends. And it's clear that what the people who invoke that term are warning against is not actually the return of some kind of white racial hierarchy, but really it's just become a synonym for Republicans. When they warn against white supremacy, they're not really talking about a white political movement. I mean, the highest status whites in the country tend to collect in the Democratic Party, of course, and there's a kind of mirror image. This is sort of a mirror image of the very few people who do support some kind of white nationalism in the U.S. A really small fringe, but it's a bit interesting. One of the things that you see when you observe them is that they really don't like whites that much. They're actually only in favor of a certain small set of whites, and they really hate and dislike lower class whites as a rule and tend to try to exclude them from whatever they're hoping to build. So the very few white nationalists we have don't seem to really be willing to extend their attempt at race solidarity across class lines. One of the many problems bedeviling that movement. And then those who see themselves as fighting against white supremacy also, really, have a beef with a lot of minorities who are white adjacent, participating at a certain remove in toxic paleness. So it's been funny to see what happens when people try to, shoehorn all of our politics into these racial categories.
Well, the online sort of racialist right was recently fractured around the question of whether authentic white cuisine consists of, sort of French fineries, foie gras, having a taste for fine wines or so on, or whether it consists of sort of middle American slop, meat and potatoes. And, this is a strong divide. But I would say the most sort of blatantly racialist types were fervent about the fact that, European civilization is sort of French haute cuisine. The unwashed masses who can't appreciate these things are, as Matthew said, just kind of not really deserving of inclusion in the greatness of white civilization, seems to be the message.
Speaking of differences between America and Europe, and perhaps differences of taste, Woody Allen, his new film, Coup de Chance, debuted at the Vienna Film Festival. It was received an ovation, warmly received by critics. It does not have a U.S. distributor, and one of the seeming reasons for this is the fact that Woody Allen, he stands accused of abuse, child sexual abuse by Dylan Farrow. This puts Woody Allen in the same category as Roman Polanski, whose recent film on the Dreyfus Affair received no distribution in the U.S. I think it's interesting to see how a certain kind of soft regime of censorship has reemerged. Great pride was taken in the 60s in the distribution of European films in the U.S. that wouldn't have been acceptable under the Hays Code, which limited what kinds of content could be depicted in films. Similarly, great pride was taken in books like Lady Chatterley's Lover, the kind of distribution of these in the West, things that once would have been impossible to obtain in England and the US, and you might have had to go to Paris to Shakespeare and Company to buy a copy. We once celebrated the decline of a regime of censorship. It now seems that we have a new one. Sohrab, you're a bit of a Catholic, I hear. Is it good? Censorship is back. What do you think?
I mean, I think the response is that censorship is inevitable. And it's just the question of whether or not it's done on a reasonable basis, that there's avenues for contestation and kind of reaction and so on. And the fear with this sort of censorship is that it's driven by a combination of mobs and private entities who can silence someone without any kind of reasonable basis and ability to dispute the censorship as you would, through, for example, church processes and so on. You don't have any of that here. It's just mob plus, private actors choosing not to cover a piece of news or not to give a book or a movie or whatever kind of deal to an important artist. I think that that's pretty troubling. But no, I mean, I will famously defend the idea of censorship in principle, to my dying days. So yeah, I mean, that's where I am. Interestingly, the first I heard about this movie was from my wife. She was like, I want to see this Woody Allen movie, are we taking a trip to Europe somewhere at some point where we can watch it? And I was like, Woody Allen movie? Like, huh? Yeah. I mean, I was out of the loop because I hadn't seen any trailers for it because it's not getting released in the United States, but apparently my wife had been sort of aware of it. So I do plan to see it somehow before the year is out, preferably on the big screen.
Cinema is a particularly vulnerable medium, because the kind of, various monopolies on distribution make it very hard to get a film out there and be able to, collect revenue for it. It does pose problems that, it seems like, I think this publisher is called Skyhorse, but it's kind of published a lot of sort of new agey and conspiracy adjacent kind of material historically, but, they seem to have a practice now of just snapping up any book that gets canceled by a mainstream publisher. They will just publish it. And so, I think it seems like in the realm of books, it's been possible for outlets to, or for kind of independent publishers, and there are various means of getting a book out there that don't require a huge amount of infrastructure. But it would seem with film, it's very, very difficult to get around the infrastructure that kind of ensures the monopoly of the major studios, and now is kind of coordinated with various tech platforms. And so it is quite striking that, this film, which clearly, would do well enough. Woody Allen has enough of an audience of loyalists, myself among them, who would definitely go see it or rent it or whatever. It may simply be impossible to obtain, which is kind of, again, a sort of, unless as a kind of pirated copy, which, I have a few friends who are good at obtaining things like that. But it does seem like film is one of the most vulnerable media to this kind of action, in terms of simply making it literally impossible to obtain for an average person to be able to see it. And this, kind of strengthens the hand of these, as Sohrab was saying, sort of behind the scenes sort of mobs that, demand that work be canceled on the basis of allegations against the artist.
Just very quickly to connect last week's episode of the podcast with this one. As I mentioned, I'm going through a kick of Cronenberg movies, ones I hadn't seen, and rewatching others that I love. And among them was Crash, which was a very controversial movie when it came out in 1996. Obviously, many people walked out of the Cannes Film Festival screening, and there was booing. He was awarded a special jury prize that was led by Francis Ford Coppola, who hated it so much that he made a point of, Coppola had been outvoted by the jury, but he made a point of not himself as the foreman of the jury. I think he used that for a trial, not a prize jury. But at any rate, it seems somehow apt in this case. As the leader of the jury, or chairman of the jury, he made a point of not handing him the award himself. But beyond the controversy at film festivals, in Britain, the last real concerted push to censor a mainstream or relatively mainstream director involved Crash. The Evening Standard and the Daily Mail started a campaign, as only British newspapers can when there's like a slow news cycle, of trying to ban this movie. And of course it is unbelievably graphic and disturbing, that this will cause young kids to try to get into car accidents for their own erotic kicks and so on. And it was like the campaign was relatively effective, because the Council of Westminster did in fact ban the movie from being screened in London. But of course London has many other councils, and so like you could go to Camden or whatever and see the movie elsewhere. But it was interesting. I was watching all this because I like to watch like the commentaries track and the extra interviews and so forth. And for a very long time, and I think maybe still today, that was the last movie that was the subject of this kind of censorship brouhaha. Crash. Interestingly, the same director that we happened to have discussed last week. There has not been a similar one, certainly not in Britain, but now there's one in the US, but the quality of the censorship pressure is different. It's not the press combined with governmental authorities imposing a ban or militating for a ban and then government going along. It's just the lack of distribution, which I think is much more, I don't know, like I said, it's much harder to challenge that rather than, the old fashioned form of censorship.
Well, I think it is worth, you must be restraining yourself, but it is worth mentioning your book here, Sohrab Tyranny, Inc., which discusses the way that, corporate actors have, exert coercion and how they dominate our life, and people who oppose coercion in the public sphere often ignore that. It's really hard to imagine people today going to the Westminster Council or saying to like the district attorney of Broward County, I think of like Two Live crew and the efforts there in the 90s to ban their obscene recordings. That just wouldn't happen today. If people had an objection to an artist, they would seek redress through corporate actors and through a kind of attempt to get them to stymie it, I would think. So yeah, just the notion that you could go to a local political body and suppress a work that way, I just think is really foreign to us now.
Yes, I mean, the Crash story is a very funny one as regards Westminster Council. I believe it's still banned in Westminster, so if you're an MP, you can't go and see the film at your local cinema. But yeah, I think the sinister thing, as people are pointing out, is the targeting of distribution and also the endless nature of the prosecution. I mean, Woody Allen has been cleared multiple times, and Roman Polanski's victim, Samantha Geimer, has very publicly forgiven Polanski for his sins. I'm not trying to underplay what it is that he did. But there is this sense in which no one can ever be forgiven in the new regime, even when their name has been cleared or their victim no longer wants to be thought of in this way, and that they themselves have come to terms or even communicated with the perpetrator. So you have this kind of endless trial on behalf of the mob, which is in a way the nature of the mob, is to perpetuate this persecution. And I think it's interesting, of course, we as Sohrab mentioned, we have the censorship in Britain, although very little of it at this point. But we do have the mob, and I think it's France, really, of all of the countries in Europe, which somehow prioritizes genius over behavior. So if you're a great filmmaker or a musician, and you're French, or there's French funding, somehow you will be, or you're an American director, you will be protected, if you like, by the validation and love of genius over poor behavior, let's say. So it's France that's holding this candle.
Sohrab, if you go to Europe to see this Allen film, I would be on alert. There was a report this week that in Poland, graves have been dug up, revealing the remains of revenants, including for the first time ever the discovery of a child revenant. Now, a revenant is a dead person kind of returned to unlife. Often. It's a vampire. We have examples of this in J. Sheridan Le Fanu's classic vampire novella Carmilla, a kind of Eastern European revenant who goes around sapphically sucking blood. And these revenants were identified by the fact that they had padlocks on their toes, or iron sickles placed over their throats, or placed downward in their graves, so that if they came back to unlife, that they would, instead of emerging from the ground, sort of be faced with the bottomless earth. Where is this on our list of priorities? How worried should we be? How many articles are we going to commission on this?
Why is it always in Eastern Europe that this sort of stuff? It's like Transylvania, Poland. It's like if you look at maps of UFO sightings.
Careful! Don't step on any Eastern European toes.
Yeah, no, I know.
You could set off, some kind of national liberation movement. It could be bad.
Globally, if you look at maps of UFO sightings, they're all clustered around the United States and Britain, and then a little bit else in the Anglo world, and then tiny few sightings, in continental Europe and elsewhere. But mainly the Anglo-American world is apparently where all the UFOs visit. And likewise, there's something in the borscht that attracts the revenants. That's the only comment I have. But we should commission someone. I wonder who would among our writers would tackle this for us.
It's fun. It's fun. It's a fun story. You just say it's interesting to observe the kind of intersection of science with the kind of more lurid supermarket checkout aisle kind of tabloid interest in these things, and I don't think that's entirely coincidental that you have these archaeological stories that gain traction because of their seeming connection to the supernatural. Someone like Arthur Conan Doyle, who was kind of skeptical materialist. If you read the Holmes stories, the Hound of the Baskervilles, it's actually just a trick of the eye. It's not really a supernatural phenomenon. But he was also a spiritualist, someone really interested in contacting the dead. So I do think it's a bit funny to see the kind of you see this with like kind of mummy tales. When our scientific explorations somehow unearth these dark spiritual powers, and I do tend to think that kind of science and magic proceed hand in hand, and we're going to continue to fail to completely secularize ourselves or banish the preternatural. With that, thanks to Geoff, Sohrab, and Nina, and thanks to you, listeners.